I'm Matt Fyror. I'm the studio director at ZeniMax Online Studios.
So Matt, can you talk about how you got into producing and designing games in the early 90s?
Wow, it's a long story, but obviously it was a much different industry back then. I was kind of raised as a computer geek, and I actually sold my first game in 1985, which was just a little educational game for the school system where I grew up. But really, I didn't get into the real game industry until probably the late 80s when multi-user modem bulletin board games were huge, and some friends and I were playing one called Scepter of Goth, and it was so expensive to play, we decided to franchise our own version of it so that we could avoid the $3 an hour or something fees to play it. And we licensed it and made our own version of the game with the license, and then that company went out of business, and we're like, hey, let's just write our own. So we decided just to write our own. Not even knowing that MUDs existed, because that's basically what they were. But there was no Google then or anything, so we had no idea that Scepter of Goth was built with technology that we could probably just download from somewhere. So we wrote our own, and that came out in the early 90s as Tempest, then renamed to Darkness Falls. And that company and that technology evolved over time to become Mythic Entertainment and Dark Age of Camelot, which came out 10 years later.
I'm just curious because, there's another video game called Tempest. Did you have naming issues at the time when the game released?
Yeah, it's funny. That was our first introduction to the game industry, and that was the cease and desist letter that we got telling us that Tempest, of course, was an arcade game back then. And we knew it was an arcade game, but we didn't think anyone would actually notice, and it was a cool name. But so we changed it to Darkness Falls, and that went on. It went on as a modem game for years and years and years, and then became Mythic Entertainment, and we went from there.
That's funny. No one will notice. That's
Yeah.
that's how you think back then, I guess, when you're young. You're just like, yeah, we'll get away with it.
Yeah.
It'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, it was funny. I don't know how they found us, but not a lot of customers found us, but the lawyers did. So, and that's a cautionary tale for the industry.
So Matt, fantasy seems to be your forte. What attracts you to that genre in gaming?
It all goes back to Tolkien, right? I grew up in the 70s, and so Lord of the Rings was huge. Dungeons and Dragons kind of came out as I was becoming a teenager, and so tabletop games were, that was the first big moment for tabletop games, so it was all about D&D. And then it happened, this first game that we played, Scepter of Goth, was kind of D&D-ish, and we just kind of went that way. I have made some other games that aren't fantasy, but all the big ones were definitely based on, King Arthur Legends or variants of those, or Elder Scrolls. So yeah, I think it's just fantasy is very much understood by people that play games. And in the old days, I used to explain it like, if you're making a science fiction game, the first 2 hours of the game are explaining what science fiction type it is. Like, what are the rules? Fantasy, generally, it's understood if you're an elf, you're a magic user, and if you're a dwarf, you use a weapon. And you only have to explain kind of the variant that you're focusing on, and kind of what the cool difference between your fantasy world and the rest of the normal fantasy worlds are like. So I think it's a little easier for gamers to kind of get their heads wrapped around. And so if you look at all the big live service games, from the old days till now, a lot of them are fantasy, and I think that's the reason.
It's funny, the Elder Scrolls series has had such a long history of gaming, and to this day, I think people still argue which one the best is, and it's usually the first one you play, whether it was Morrowind or Oblivion or more recently Skyrim. Was there any pressure when you were announcing an Elder Scrolls MMO and started to work on the project to live up to all these epic games?
Tremendous pressure, but with that pressure came the tremendous awesomeness of Elder Scrolls. Like, it's set up perfectly for a virtual world, shared massive multiplayer experience. So yes, it had this is one of the largest IPs in gaming pressure, but it also came with a dedicated fan base, which we knew would be interested in the game. And the world is just set up perfectly for a game of this type.
I remember when it was first announced, a lot of people would get excited. I mean, you were coming off the heels of Skyrim at the time, and everyone was like, "Oh, it'll be Skyrim co-op." You know, like people had this really, I wouldn't want to say like misinterpretation of the game, but like the mechanics can't work as the same way as they do in Skyrim because, of course, Skyrim is not an MMO; it's a single player doing adventure, and putting another, even one other player in that world changes the dynamics and the design drastically to where it doesn't really work anymore with like the enemy design and the exploration and what you find and stuff like that. So you talk about what you learned from the past Elder Scrolls games that you applied to the MMO specifically.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because that was obviously a huge topic of discussion for us. But ZeniMax Online was founded in 2007, which was only a couple of years after Oblivion. So ESO was in development for a good 6 years before Skyrim came out. Not 5 years before Skyrim came out. So Oblivion was more our basis for what Elder Scrolls is to the community back then. And then Skyrim launched, and of course, it's one of the best games ever made. And we knew we had to change some things in ESO to make sure that it would be approachable to players of Skyrim. So a lot of the later design decisions in the cycle were made because of Skyrim's success. And that's things like first-person view was not in the game before that, and we put it in because of Skyrim. Fully voiced quests were not part of the original design, but we did that because of Skyrim. And we basically wanted to make it feel like that experience that players had just had in Skyrim and make it feel as much as possible like that, while explaining all the other players in the game and that it's different too.
Can you talk about how, like, when you made a game like Dark Age of Camelot, like how you feel that helped you in your design phase for Elder Scrolls Online?
Well, it helped because me, and a lot of the team that I got at ZOS also worked on Camelot. So I think we had been through it before, and if you've ever worked on a game of this type, it's hard. Like, it's the hardest game to make because it's not just the game design, it's the huge IT exercise the game runs on. It's a direct relationship with the customer. It's payment, it's payment processing. All that stuff is part of making a game like this. And I think a lot of developers that start making games of this type don't understand that, and that you need not only a kick-ass AAA game development team, but you also need a kick-ass back-end services, processing, infrastructure, data center team. And it's not for the faint of heart. Like, it's a lot of work and really, really complicated. So I think what helped us the most is understanding kind of the massive size of the footprint the game would have and not underestimating that side of it. That being said, it was tremendously difficult to make it, and it was a very long, complicated development process. But at least we knew it was going to be when we started.
Speaking to that process, you mentioned the idea started in 2007 as when the game started, and at that time, cross-play and cross-save were still like, there was no way. Like, it wasn't even a conversation back in those days. Like, playing on multiple platforms, that's like, it just didn't work unless you were PC and Mac, and you would have to have a Mac client for that. But one of the things I always ask Rich Lambert, and he's constantly getting asked about, is cross-playing and cross-save integration. Can you go ahead and elaborate on like why it's so hard for a game like this to integrate something so revolutionary and relatively new in the gaming space?
So it's not difficult technically to do crossplay. The problem we have with crossplay, there's a couple problems. One is the game is so large that if we merge servers now, all the players wouldn't fit on one server because it's way too many people. Number two is that we allow modding on PC, and we do not allow it on console for obvious reasons. And that would give PC players, just a leg up in PvP, and they would, they can customize their experience a little better to their play style, and console players use the console interface. And so I think since the experience is different on platforms, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to do PC console crossplay. That being said, console to console is something we've discussed, but we have huge, vibrant communities on both consoles, and there's no real reason to do it right now. It's like, and again, both the servers are very full, and I don't even know how we would merge them if we tried.
So how do you have to think in terms of design with an MMO specifically and more specifically as a live service game, you have to probably think a little bit different than you do with a single player adventure like Last of Us or Resident Evil 8, something like that.
Well, yeah, you're asking about the game design and you know, of multiplayer Elder Scrolls versus single players Elder Scrolls.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is I've really, amazingly, after being in the industry for so long, I have never made a single player game. So not once since 1992 or whatever. So I think that helps, like having experience of doing that, of having so much multiplayer experience. So I think it's funny. I'll go into a short digression here of how we actually screwed ourselves by trying to make it feel more single player, which is I think illustrative of the problem. And that is that the Elder Scrolls games in general are super good about allowing you to change the world. Like when you do something, NPCs around you start talking about it, you can actually change the tide of war in Skyrim by choosing sides. We wanted to have that concept in ESO. We wanted to make it so if you went to a village and it was under attack by enemies, you could, you know, help turn the tide and save the village. And then whenever you went back to the village, it would be safe and it wouldn't be under attack anymore, right? Common fantasy problem. So we put a lot of time and effort into allowing you to change the world that way. And we had a lot of technical techniques behind the scenes that when I went to the village and it was under attack, I was on one layer. But after I did the quest, I went back to that village and I was on the other layer where it was happy and fun and everyone thanked me. That sounds great, right? The problem is in real life in a multiplayer game, if I'm playing with friends and they haven't done that quest yet, and I have, I go into that area and we're suddenly split into two different areas and can't play with each other. And imagine a massive game like ESO that had that technology all over the place, and you end up with one of our largest issues from 2014, which is what the players called player separation. And that was that they would just be, to them, walking down a path in the woods and suddenly your friend would disappear. And that's because you were entering an area that was set up for changing the world. And so we spent a lot of time and money in 2014 and 2015 backing out of all of those and making them so they were not player separation areas.
You know, it's funny you say that, and there's another MMO that's very popular out there that me and my brother play a lot, and that happens consistently, even in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah.
Just we'll be together and be like, well, why are you instance out? I don't understand. Like, where are you? We're like, we have to Google and figure out why I can't group with you. Oh, it's because there's this quest line you didn't do yet. So yeah, it's cool technology, but it can be frustrating even if you do it right. It can be confusing.
Yeah. So we made the decision after we launched that we are going to err on the side of playability and not on world consistency, if you want to call it that. Like, we want to make sure we do everything we can to keep players together and happy. And so a lot of our design decisions after that stem from that decision.
I think in a more traditional MMO game, or even sometimes in RPGs, you have to kind of funnel the player into a certain direction. You know, stay at this zone 1 to 10, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. That the kind of design, traditional design, you don't have to do anymore. You can now have the world level up around you, and the player can go wherever. Can you talk about what that was like implementing into your game? Because
that's interesting, because that was the logical conclusion of the player separation lesson that we learned. We called that system One Tamriel, and we actually, right before launch, we made a list of things that we knew that we had to work on after launch, because these games are never done, and that was always on the list. And we got to it finally about 2 years after launch. And so that was the idea where playing with other people is more important than making you feel super powerful in some situations. So yeah, the traditional progression is I level out of an area, and then when I go back to it, it's just ridiculously easy. So a world boss that would have killed me in one shot, you know, at level 10, at level 50, I can go back and sneeze on him and he's dead. So that's not really an Elder Scrolls thing anyway. Like, most Elder Scrolls games have world leveling with you. So you don't get in those situations. So a troll was always a bastard to fight, right? And it's never easy. So we brought that concept in and made it so you were automatically leveled to the level of the zone. but we stacked the zone with different types of content. So there was base content, more difficult content, and then super difficult content. So you still needed to group with players. Your gear still makes a huge difference on whether you can solo some of those more powerful creatures. And we basically made every zone like a miniature version of the game. So you can go into a zone and have fun no matter what level you are. That opened up the world immediately to, I don't have to go through the game in a certain way. I can just pick a point and just run to it and have fun, which is a very Elder Scrolls thing to do. And most importantly, it allowed you to group with anyone you wanted, no matter what level they are, which made the game suddenly much happier, fun, more fun. Players love to group with each other. It really toned down the, noob, you're not high enough level to group with us, because it doesn't really matter anymore. And that alone made the game really, really accessible to new users. When a new player comes into the game, and we have still 7 years later have millions of people coming into the game every year, it doesn't matter where they start. They can play the new content, they can play the old content. They don't have to grind through all the old stuff to get to the new stuff. They can just do whatever they want. And that concept alone is why ESO is so successful.
In 2003 and 4, we saw a massive, surge in MMOs, starting with, the one that everyone knows I'm talking about. But since then, we've seen so many try and fail. Obviously, you mentioned launches are always rocky, but even after that point, there have been a ton that have just kind of fallen off quietly and just, passed on. Why do you think Elder Scrolls Online succeeded when so other MMO games have failed?
There are a couple answers to that. One is that the company, and by that I mean Bethesda and ZeniMax, believed in the team and the game. And once we showed them the plan to make the game better, after 2014, they bought into that and supported us. And not a lot of companies would have done that. And that it just shows how much a game's perception, the community's perception of a game, can change over time if a company is willing to invest in the team and make sure that they get the game to where it needs to be. The other side of that is that we build in a lot of tools to monitor what players are doing in the game. So even in 2014, when the game launched and the perception was it wasn't a giant success, there was a ton of people in there that played the game every day. And we knew we had something, because we could see them and they literally logged in every day. And so we looked at what they were doing and did more of those things and kind of buffed out those systems and did less of the things they weren't interested in, and kind of built the game's future roadmap around that.
Obviously, and you've been in the industry since 91, pre-91, you've been in the industry for a long time. Can you talk about some of the development practices you used back in 1996?
Yeah, the biggest difference is scale. When Dark Age of Camelot launched, I think we were 30 developers, right? And that's not even the size of the IT team on ESO, right? It's just the scale is just so different. Back then, we didn't have meetings really at, definitely pre-Camelot. Mythic shipped, I think, 13 games between 1995 and 2001, which kept us afloat until we did Camelot. But we were between 10 and 15 to 20 people at that point, and there weren't meetings. Everyone kind of sat together and just talked, and it was very collaborative. Everybody did 13 jobs. I mean, I was the sound designer, producer, healthcare benefits administrator, and email system administrator back then, right? And that's just the way it was. It was much looser, much more freedom, and much more collaborative. And it was just easier to keep track of everything when games were smaller and teams were smaller. So the production practices back then were much like it is now at heart: find the right people that can make the right decisions and turn them loose. Now it's that, but there are always layers and layers and layers between me as the studio head and the people that are actually doing that. And so that's the biggest difference, I think, between them.
Yeah, John Romero said in an interview when I asked him that question that he, everyone's you have producers now on projects, but back then everyone was a producer. You know what I mean? Whether you were a coder or whatever, everyone had their own job to keep track of, and it's funny how that, because he doesn't like producers and he ended up becoming one. So.
and back then, I mean, it's still a running joke in the industry, but especially back then, every studio had a different definition of producer. In one studio, the producer was the decision maker on everything, and on another one, it was someone who took notes in a meeting. And like there, it just depended on the culture and the definition of actually what a producer is.
And then what are some of the development practices that you mentioned from the past 25 years that you miss today that you don't use anymore?
Well, we all miss the small teams, I think, which, I mean, it's obviously with the scale and complexity of games these days, you can't do that anymore. At least to make this kind of game. You know, what I really miss is knowing everything that was going on all the time, where everyone on the team knew what was going on all the time back then because it was smaller, and now it's meetings and meetings of meetings and then meetings of meetings of meetings, and you know, big problems sometimes take weeks or months to surface, where before it would be like walking by, seeing someone do something and go, why are you doing that, and then it would be instantaneous. And so it's just a different culture and scale these days.
On the flip side of that question, what modern development practices do you feel are superior to what you used 10, 15, 25 years ago?
Definitely all of the utilities that have grown up that help game development, like Perforce, which lets you make sure that you can roll back code and know who checked in what problem, usually be able to point fingers at people that introduce problems to the code base. Like we didn't use any of that back in the old days. It was the lead programmer just assembled all the code and assembled it and integrated it into his version, and he debugged it that way. And that was great when it was 5 or 7 engineers, but a lot of problems resulted from that. And with the modern, of course this is from like 2000 on, lots of tools grew up that enabled that so that larger teams could be more collaborative and manage that check-in process and manage the build deploy process. And it's just a lot easier now to read a log file of what's in a new version instead of relying on word of mouth from the person that did it.
Since 1996, we've gone from PlayStation 1 to 5 and multiple renditions of Xbox and terrible naming models of Xbox, let's be honest. And Nintendo's, obviously dominating the market with the Switch, and PC hardware has gotten exponentially crazy with RTXs and 390s and stuff like that. What are some trends over the past 25 years that you remember as being big step forwards in the industry in terms of development or distribution or marketing or even customer engagement?
Yeah, it was funny. I remember my first 3D polygon game, which I think was Quake 1, that I actually had the game and the Voodoo 1 or whatever the
Voodoo
card
32
was.
60 megabyte graphics card of power.
To do that. And I remember we all clustered around my computer at work, and I installed it. We're like, wow, this is 3D. And we looked at it like, wow, this looks like hell, because back then, sprite-based games were really good. A lot of them were hand-drawn, the animations were good, and it was a big step back fidelity-wise to get to 3D. Obviously, once you start to explore the world, you understand how much better true 3D can be, and it caught up very quickly. But to me personally, it really hasn't changed what I do, because I've, everything you just said, from a original console to a PC to a Mac to a Switch, is really just like a window that you're looking through to a world that you're creating. And the only question is, how is that world represented through the window? And there are techniques we did even back in the, late 90s that made it look as good as possible. It restricted the view, obviously. You couldn't do a lot of things, but you could make a great game. Now you can make it look almost real. You can have far better animations. The shaders are much better, but it doesn't change the job that we're doing, which is, I want to make a compelling virtual world. I only have this little window for the user to look through. What technology am I going to use to make it look as good or as compelling as I can?
That's a good answer. What industry changes surprised you the most over the last 25 years?
It's hard to be surprised at this point by anything. I think the biggest change from, and of course, most people would say here the internet, but I always made multiplayer games. Like my first internet-based game was in 1995, Splatterball on Engage Games Online, for those that remember. But I think the biggest change that I saw personally was the revolution in direct-to-consumer relationships with studios. So, before, and we worked with publishers in the old days. These are all online publishers. America Online would be the biggest one anyone remembers. But when we did Camelot, we actually saw what other companies were doing at the time, and we did a direct-to-consumer credit card service. Talk to the community directly through, at that time, blog posts, because there was no social media. And that, it sounds so trite now that there's social media and Twitter, but the fact that we could post something on a website and people would go to it and listen to us directly was a huge, huge game changer for us. So we did things like, regular developer Q&A on our website, and our community manager, Sonia Thomas, Sonia Weathers now, set up like a grab bag column that ran every Friday, and players would have huge engagement from the Camelot community. And it was the basis for companies really, really becoming directly connected to their customers, which until then in the game industry, you were always going through a marketing group, you were always going through a publisher, you were never really allowed to talk directly with your customers. And it was a big, big, big change.
So just actually speaking of that, it's just because I'm curious, because in 1996, we'd start to see the rise of console gaming with PlayStation and 64. From your perspective, how did that affect your, at that time, how did that affect your industry? Like from your perspective? Because I mean, publishers were pushing for consoles because, they were cheaper, more affordable. Like for people, PCs were still relatively really expensive in the mid 90s. I remember because we didn't even have one until 1999. Because they were just, and the one we had before that was just didn't play anything because it was crap,
Yeah, so we were always PC developers, and we were always online PC developers. So we don't, like, for me personally, the console revolution didn't really happen until it was multiplayer, because that was what I was doing, and that was the first, the Xbox, the first Xbox for me. I think there was a way to do multiplayer on other consoles before that, but that was the big game changer for us. And at Mythic, we actually worked on a multiplayer Camelot sequel that was going to be on console, and it got killed eventually, but it was really cool. And it was my first taste of getting into console development. So I think consoles really didn't have an effect on me as a developer. Obviously, I played console games, but PS2 was probably my first one. But that first Xbox with Xbox Live, with the multiplayer built in, with the idea of having a community built in that you could chat with and stuff, that was a game changer for
awesome. So my last question for you, Matt, is Shacknews is a website that's turning 25 years old this year. Do you have any fun stories, or you can talk about the site? Did you ever go to it? Did you ever commit a chatty account? Did you remember when it first came out in 1996, when it was a Quake fans site, anything like that?
Yeah, so a couple, yes, I of course know Shacknews. It was around in the day when there was like Blues News, and like it was just really, really old school type thing. So, but my only Shacknews anecdote is at Mythic for a while we were addicted to a Quake level called Ziggurat Vertigo, which was a Quake level that had limited gravity. So it was you kind of floated around all the time, and you had to jump. And we actually got that tip from Shacknews, and I could, because I remember one of the engineers, Brian Axelson, who worked on he actually worked on ESO also, who worked with us at Mythic, who always just completely destroyed us all the time in Quake, told us about this level, and he's like, I won't kill you guys quite so quickly because movement is so slow. And I read about this, and he gave us the link, and it was Shacknews, and that was where we read about it. So that was awesome. The first time I remember hearing about it, and that was probably whenever Quake 1 was Quake 2, I think. But so it was late 90s. Matt Fyroor, do it for Shacknews.